On this Friday night, China fires back.
We could expect some retaliation.
Beijing's escalating rhetoric after Ottawa banned Chinese tech giant Huawei, plus the implications for Canadian consumers.
Canadians will continue to pay some of the highest rates in the world.
Still in power, with no replacement in sight, Jason Kenney remains in his post as Alberta's premier for now. Where does his divided party go from here? Confirmed cases. With monkeypox now verified in Canada, the search is on for a source.
What we need to do is to identify all of the cases, really understand the scope of what we're dealing with.
Plus, prisoners of war, the uncertain fate of hundreds of Ukrainian fighters.
My husband is on the way from one hell to another hell.
And the Russian musician being jailed for his show of support.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Tracy Tong.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. The political fallout taking shape after Canada made the move to ban Chinese tech giant Huawei from 5G networks in the name of national security. The decision, critics say, took far too long and leaves Canada in a vulnerable position as telecom companies have 2 years to remove Huawei's 5G equipment.
It took 3 years to announce a ban, and Huawei is still operating in Canada. The government wasted precious time, and now they ask us to wait even longer for legislation that will finally protect Canadians and close this embarrassing chapter for our country.
Well, tonight, many are holding their breath for possible retaliation from China that could see increased risk and tension for Canadian travel and trade. Our Abigail Bimman leads our coverage tonight from Ottawa.
Beijing is planning a, quote, comprehensive and serious assessment of Canada's decision to ban Huawei, which China claims violates free trade. The embassy in Ottawa said Canada's so-called security concerns are just a pretext for political manipulation.
We could expect some retaliation.
I'll be annoyed that it came just a day after they had lifted the ban on the two canola firms. But I'm not sure that it will delay or reverse Chinese efforts to rebuild a relationship.
China watchers are divided on both if and how the country may choose to strike back.
Any retaliation by the Chinese regime will only worsen relations. It's to no one's benefit whatsoever.
Charles Burton says China could do lots of things: block exports, kick out Canadian journalists, cyber spying, or more arrests. Many thinking of Canadian Robert Schellenberg, detained since 2014 and facing a death sentence.
I think the level of risk for Canadians in China, whether they're businessmen or English teachers or students, has been enhanced.
The Prime Minister signaled Canada is braced for retaliation, particularly on trade.
We understand that it may well lead to challenges at the World Trade Organization, but we feel that it is extremely important to stand up for Canadian protection, Canadian interests, and Canadian safety.
Though some question how safe things really are, both in terms of how much longer it took Canada to make this decision than allies, and because there's still time before companies need to remove Huawei gear.
In the meantime, for 4 years, Canada is going to be exposed to exactly the national security risk that we've been concerned about all along.
Global Affairs Canada currently recommends using a high degree of caution if traveling to China. We asked if there are any plans to change the advisory, and we're told they monitor safety and security 24/7. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
So what does this mean for Canadians and data? As Anne Gaviola tells us, the already slow implementation of 5G in this country could be about to see even more delays.
After years of policy limbo, it should be full steam ahead for Canada's much-anticipated 5G rollout, the new generation of wireless technology that will allow for truly unlimited data plans and things like smart homes and cars. 4 Canadian telecoms, including the big 3, Bell, TELUS, and Rogers, have started deploying 5G, but it's not the full 9 yards. Think of it as 4.5G. Experts say Canada has lots of catching up to do.
Canada is a lot further away from that 5G rollout compared to other countries like the US, like South Korea.
This has been a long time coming. The US banned Huawei 3 years ago. Canada's delay comes at a price. Samer Bichet is the man behind Ice Wireless, which provides wireless service to thousands of customers in remote northern communities.
That is their lifeline. That's their connection to the world.
His company, which specializes in the technology that makes Zoom and Skype calls possible, relies heavily on Huawei components and has invested tens of millions because they're cheap and very reliable in cold climates. He says this announcement puts small players that serve remote and rural communities at a disadvantage against the deep-pocketed Big Three, who opted for more expensive alternatives.
The ugly part here is Canadians will continue to pay some of the highest rates in the world because the incumbents will continue to have the upper hand.
If the government had made a decision sooner, then those smaller players could have figured out a different alternative route to what they could have done instead of already placing out all of that infrastructure in those northern communities.
A national security ban that impacts household budgets across the country. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
The United Conservatives in Alberta are divided, but Jason Kenney is reversing course since announcing his resignation Wednesday night and will remain the Premier of Alberta and the leader of the party until a new leader is chosen. Now, that was decided after a day-long caucus meeting yesterday in Calgary. And that is where we find Global's Tom Vernon, who's been following the events up to this week, including a UCP cabinet meeting today. Tom, how does Kenney plan to continue to lead the party after what's happened?
Tracy, he says after that long caucus meeting yesterday and him remaining on as Premier until a new leader is elected is a sign of a government that continues to do the people's business as it works to find a new leader. Now, he entered this cabinet meeting to a standing ovation from his cabinet ministers. This was a photo opportunity for the meeting. He sat down and in his comments he spoke about UCP government priorities, fighting Bill C-69 in court, building the economy and dealing with inflation. Now, it was a marathon caucus meeting that led to him remaining in power. He obviously had enough votes in caucus to keep hold of the top job. Now, we spoke with one of the Constituency Association presidents, one of the grassroots members that has worked so hard to remove Jason Kenney, and he says, well, look, this is what they expected, but they have accomplished their mission.
After my initial feelings of perhaps disappointment, some shock, maybe even a little bit of anger, we were still able to accomplish what the number one objective was, and that was to see Jason Kenney no longer the leader of our party.
Now, what's very interesting is we haven't heard from any of his opponents just yet. People like Brian Jean, who going into yesterday's caucus meeting made their thoughts pretty clear. They were going in to remove him as leader and elect an interim leader. In fact, the only comment we've heard was actually from Brian Jean's camp, and they said in the statement, Brian is going to let Albertans and the grassroots digest the unusual events of the last 2 days before he comments. Always interesting times here, Tracy.
We'll have to see where this story takes us next. Tom Vernon in Calgary, thank you so much.
You bet.
Canadian healthcare officials continue to look for cases of monkeypox after 2 people in Quebec tested positive for the virus. Now, the story we're about to show you includes footage of people with the disease. Jamie Morocker has more on how monkeypox is spreading around the world and how we can protect each other.
Scientists at Winnipeg's National Microbiology Lab have been tasked with testing monkeypox samples taken from Quebec patients.
We understand from other countries that are reporting cases that the current monkeypox strain, or clade if you like, is the West African clade. We have not yet confirmed that in Canada.
It would be unusual. None of the confirmed cases or more than 20 potential cases under investigation in Quebec have recently traveled to Africa, where monkeypox is seen annually. Dr. Anne Ramoyne has spent 2 decades studying the disease in the region and says finding the origin of spread is now key.
Right now, we just don't have those answers. So it's really important to go back to the beginning and remember that we're in very early days. What we need to do is to identify all of the cases, really understand the scope of what we're dealing with, and then look to see what kind of common denominator there is.
Clusters of the virus have been reported in Britain, Spain, and Portugal, with more cases popping up in the US, Australia, and across Europe. Dr. Robert Pilarski works at a sexual health clinic in Montreal and treated some of the suspected patients.
Should we vaccinate everybody? I do not think. Should we vaccinate people who are at high risk? I believe it would be a very wise idea.
Public health officials are considering a ring strategy that would include using a smallpox vaccine for close contacts of those infected. Doses have proven effective against monkeypox and are already being offered in Britain.
Smallpox was eradicated in 1980 in terms of, vaccination campaigns. I think in Canada it stopped in the early 70s. And so I would say generally that the entire population is susceptible to this, to monkeypox.
Officials wouldn't say how many smallpox vaccines are available. For those seeking personal protective options, you might feel a sense of déjà vu. Experts recommend masking, hand washing, and physical distancing when needed, mitigation measures with which we've become all too familiar. Jamie Marocker, Global News, Toronto.
Canada has imposed sanctions on 14 more Russians associated with Vladimir Putin's regime. Ottawa is also banning the export and import of some luxury goods to and from Russia, including alcohol, clothing, and jewelry. It comes as a Ukrainian commander says troops have ended their defense of Mariupol's Azovstal steelworks, effectively giving Russia full control of Ukraine's southeastern coastal area. Redmond Shannon reports.
According to the Kremlin, this is the last group of exhausted and deflated Ukrainian troops walking out of the Azovstal steelworks after more than 80 days inside the bombarded facility. Russia now claims all 2,400 Ukrainian troops inside have surrendered.
Slava Ukraini!
Earlier Friday, the leader of the Azov battalion admitted the fight for Azovstal was over. Russia says he was taken away in an armoured car, they say, to prevent locals from attacking him. Russia's invasion was predicated on the far-right roots of the Azov battalion, so his capture would be a key propaganda victory for the Kremlin. In Turkey, the wives of some of the other Ukrainian soldiers appealed for help, fearing what will happen to them.
My husband is on the way from one hell to another hell, from Azovstal plant to the prison.
Change the hearts and converts the hearts with horrors like this.
The Vatican's foreign secretary visited the site of mass graves north of Kyiv Friday, responding to calls for Pope Francis to travel to Ukraine or to help with peace talks.
He knows that there is a desire for a visit, and he is more than willing to assist either himself personally or through his immediate collaborators.
Bombing continues across the east, including at this cultural center in Kharkiv region. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the eastern Donbas region is now completely destroyed. Russia's defense minister claims his forces will soon have control over the entire Luhansk part of the Donbas. Russian natural gas giant Gazprom announced Friday it will now suspend all sales to Finland for failing to pay its bills in rubles, just days after Finland and Sweden formally applied to join NATO. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
A pianist who played the Ukrainian national anthem in public has been found guilty of Nazi propaganda by a Russian court. A video posted to social media shows Vladimir Fofanov playing the piano in the Siberian city of Tyumen. The city's court says that amounts to shouting slogans of banned organizations. Now, the video does not show Fofanov shouting or speaking any slogans. He has been sentenced to 14 days in jail. Coming up, tracing a serial number. The calls for ramped up gun tracing from Canada's law enforcement. A lot can be learned about the history and life of an illegal gun by tracing its serial number, where it was manufactured and sold, and who bought it. It's an important tool when a gun is found at a crime scene to help identify traffickers. Now, Global News has learned only about 10 to 20% of crime guns are being traced in Canada. Tonight, we bring you part 3 of our investigative series, Following the Path of One Gun. We went looking for Jermaine Welsh. He's a Canadian who was living in Michigan in 2014 when he and several others were arrested after purchasing more than 100 guns that were smuggled into Canada.
I used to live here 2.5 years ago.
Global News has learned Welsh's brother and co-conspirator, Stephen Durand, was sentenced to 60 months in prison for his part in the scheme. Welsh received a sentence of 36 months probation in Texas. for one count of false statement during acquisition of a firearm, or as the ATF calls it, lying and buying. Family members tell us they both eventually moved back to the Greater Toronto area.
The way I know him, I don't think he was bringing it to her for anybody to get harmed by it.
But they're guns.
Yeah. So I don't think he was even thinking.
Without those guns in Canada, Jeremy would still be alive.
18-year-old Jeremy Cook and 14-year-old Lysette Ross were killed in separate shootings in Ontario in the summer of 2015 by one of those guns, a Taurus PT-740 Slim. Melissa Cook, wearing a pendant containing her son's ashes around her neck, says the people who pulled the trigger are not the only ones responsible.
I think we need to find out where these guns are coming from, how they're getting into our country. They have blood on their hands too.
Why isn't Jermaine Welsh charged with buying and giving these guns to criminals?
In an unprecedented move in Canada last year, Toronto police charged a convicted gun smuggler with criminal negligence causing death after one of the guns he smuggled from Florida was allegedly used in a fatal shooting. The case is still before the courts.
I hope that it becomes a common theme, and that when you buy a gun at a gun show in Florida, it might cross your mind that, geez, if this gets used somewhere, I could be held responsible.
While an additional charge of criminal negligence might act as a deterrent, defense lawyers argue it may not hold up in court.
If you then go and charge someone later on with negligence causing death, and you've already factored it into their first sentence, you may be almost not double dipping, but retrying the same case. And there's principles against charging people for the same offense twice.
When somebody is killed with a firearm, where should the responsibility for that death stop?
That's the million-dollar question.
It was a trace done by the ATF that showed us the path of a single gun, from its point of sale at a gun show in Taylor, Michigan, to the Detroit-Windsor border, later killing a teenager in London, Ontario, and then another in Toronto. It also told us who purchased the gun to start this deadly chain of events.
And without that tracing, there's no way to identify these people.
Officials say last year, more than 30,000 guns were seized in Canada. About half are considered crime guns, and ideally, every crime gun recovered would be traced. But right now, Canadian law enforcement agencies are estimated to be tracing just over 10%.
Ontario traces routinely. They trace about 2,000 guns a year. The rest of the provinces, we're still working on them.
I think if the government was doing enough, then we wouldn't have the numbers that we have out there right now. We can't accept it. Like, how many children are being taken? How many families are being pulled apart? For what reason? There's no good reason.
Ahead, Buffalo mourns the lives lost in a racially motivated mass shooting. The first funeral for one of the victims of last week's deadly supermarket shooting took place in New York today. At a vigil last night, all of the victims were honored. Hundreds of people gathered inside this Buffalo church to mourn those lost in Saturday's mass shooting. 10 people, all of whom were Black, were killed in an attack authorities are calling a racially motivated hate crime. More than 17 million Australians are heading to the polls to choose a new leader. Voters are highlighting pandemic-fueled inflation, the cost of living, and climate change as key issues for an election choice. Scott Morrison's Conservative coalition is seeking a fourth three-year term, and he's looking to remain in the top job as the 30th Prime Minister of the country. Recent polls show the center-left Labour Party, led by Anthony Albanese, has narrowed the gap with their main opposition. Next, why Indigenous leaders remain optimistic about the road to royal reconciliation. Prince Charles and his wife Camilla have wrapped up their whirlwind visit to Canada, but their calls for meaningful action on reconciliation and climate change remain.
We simply must learn practical lessons from traditional knowledge through deep connections to land and water about how we should treat our planet.
The prince says he was deeply moved by those who spoke about their experiences in residential schools. As Heather Urix-West explains, Indigenous leaders say the visit has left them hopeful.
It was a spectacle the northern indigenous community of Deta won't soon forget. Just 220 members of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation call this place home. But with the eyes of the world on them, Elder Berna Martin was ready to share her thoughts with the community's distinguished guests.
Indigenous women that go missing, murder, that's a big one. And residential school, that's a big issue too. And we have to deal with it every day.
The Prince of Wales and his wife, the Duchess of Cornwall, spent a busy afternoon with Indigenous leaders in Deta and Yellowknife, their third stop in a whirlwind 3-city Canadian tour with a focus on reconciliation. When Prince Charles delivered his farewell address, he told the community he had been touched by their stories.
It has been deeply moving to have met survivors of residential schools who, with such courage, have shared their experiences. On behalf of my wife and myself, I want to acknowledge their suffering and to say how much our hearts go out to them and their families.
He stopped short of apologizing on behalf of the Crown, though Indigenous leaders who met with the Prince earlier this week say they are hopeful about the road ahead. On Twitter, the president of the Métis Nation of Canada said, throughout his visit, Prince Charles has demonstrated his receptiveness to the many stories, including the profoundly difficult ones. I felt he truly listened during our conversation and is open to exploring a shared pathway forward. Prince of Wales and his wife returned to the UK late Thursday with a promise to remain in close touch. His 19th visit to Canada, unlikely to be his last. Heather Urix West, Global News, Yellowknife.
And that is Global National for this Friday. I'm Tracy Tong. Tonight's Your Canada is Kamloops, British Columbia. Thanks so much for watching.